Welcome to the 2025 Point-in-Time Count virtual training. Thank you again for your interest in learning more about homelessness in Indianapolis. My name is Abe Roll. I'm the HMIS data narrator at CHIP, and I am so excited today to provide you a brief introduction to the causes of homelessness in our city and the ways that you, as a resident, can help make a difference. To begin today's training, I want to ground us in some important truths. Any discussion on addressing and ending homelessness needs to be data-driven and evidence-based. That is critical. And so we are going to talk data today. But when I share data points, these aren't just data points. What we're talking about are real, sacred human lives, all of whom have the right to be housed. The data points are reflective of parents, grandparents, children, and neighbors in our city who are having a traumatic experience. And so I challenge us all to keep that at the forefront of our mind today. Again, these are Indianapolis residents who are having a traumatic experience, and we have to talk about that with the dignity they deserve. So our first goal today is to touch on the question, what causes homelessness? Why does Indianapolis continue to see folks experiencing homelessness in our city? And to answer that question, we're actually going to look at two separate questions. The first being, why are some people forced to leave their home? The second, when they do, why can't they get housed again? And I'm going to go ahead and answer both of these questions by saying that homelessness is a systemic economic and housing issue, and that can sometimes surprise people. If you were to approach someone and ask them why homelessness exists, you'd likely hear something about individual level factors. Particularly, you'd probably hear about substance use, mental health conditions, and it's true, those are very real and very serious issues that we have to address, but those issues are not to blame for the increase in homelessness that we're seeing in the nation. At the end of the day, homelessness is an economic and housing issue, and it's an issue that is either going to be addressed by policy or sustained by policy. And to talk about homelessness in Indianapolis, we also have to talk about what it looks like to be housed in Indianapolis, to have housing. So here in Indy, homeownership is not equal. Younger households, households with lower educational attainment, and most households of color are generally more likely to rent their home here in Indianapolis. So not only do those households lose out on potential equity building, but it's also not as cheap to rent in Indianapolis as a lot of people assume. For nearly a decade, the median rent for studio and one-bedroom apartments here in Indianapolis has been higher than fair market rent. So that means that the rent for those units is higher than what the federal government essentially has deemed reasonable for our area. And that's troubling, especially when we consider that Indianapolis households are often struggling. Consistently, year after year, we see at least 40% of Indianapolis households cannot cover their cost of living. And what that means is that 40% of Indianapolis is either living in poverty or they're employed and their employment gives them too much income to qualify for poverty assistance, but not enough income to cover those costs of living. And then when we zone specifically into renting households, what we saw in 2023 was that the majority of those renting households, they're making less than $50,000 a year. And that includes not just single renters, but also renters with larger families for who $50,000 is going to be really hard to stretch across the year. We also want to take a look at the effects of COVID-19 and the pandemic. The organization House Canary released research that showed that following the height of COVID, rent in the Indianapolis area increased more than any other metro area in the country. More than Silicon Valley, more than Chicago, more than New York, Indianapolis rent went up the most. And so you take all that together, and it's no surprise that a third of the Indianapolis households are spending at least 30% of their income before tax just on their housing. So that means a third of Indianapolis households have, at most, 70% of their income to cover taxes, childcare, healthcare, education, savings, transportation, and that is a hard economic position to be in. So all of these economic truths come together, and it paints a really grim situation. What we saw in 2022 was that on average, every single month, over 920 households were evicted, and over 100 households were filing for foreclosure. So to reiterate, that means at least 1,000 households in Indianapolis were forced to leave their home every single month that year just because they could not afford to stay there. It is a serious economic issue. And in addition to economic factors, there's of course a myriad of reasons people may have to leave their home. People's homes sometimes become unsafe. We know domestic violence is a huge issue in our state. We also see family intolerance forcing a lot of youth to leave their home. It's particularly true for a lot of our queer youth. We also know that sometimes life happens. We can lose a home to a disaster like fire, or your home becomes uninhabitable. But none of these reasons fully explain why we see homelessness in our city. Because regardless of the why someone leaves their home, what we should see is that they have a smooth and equitable access to a supply of housing that meets their needs. And today we don't have that, and we want to look at why. So part of the reason why is because of our supply of housing. If you take a look at this figure, let's say that every gray house that you see here is 1% of all the housing in Marion County. So one little house icon, that is 1% of all the existing housing that a person could go into instead of entering into homelessness. But of course, we have to take into account housing is often already occupied. When we do that, we see that about 94% of the housing units in Marion County have someone living there full time. So the pool of housing that a person could potentially enter into instead of going into a shelter or a street, they've now slipped to 6% of all housing. However, that 6% of vacant housing also includes abandoned buildings, buildings people only live in part-time, Airbnbs. So we have to again narrow our focus to the portion of vacant housing that is actually available for rent or for sale. And unfortunately, when we do that, we see that only about a third of those vacant units are actually available for folks to move into. So if someone is forced to leave their home and they don't want to go into shelter, they don't want to couch surf, they don't want to sleep outside, only 6% of all other housing is vacant, and less than 1 in 3 of that vacant housing is going to be something they could actually move into. There's just not enough places for folks to go. And supply is just one issue. We also know that what's available, not necessarily affordable. If Marion County wanted to house every single renting household who made under $35,000 a year, we would need more than 20,000 additional units that are affordable at that level. If we wanted to house every renting household that makes under $20,000, we would need over 34,000 units that are affordable at that level. Our rents are going up to the degree that those with less means cannot get and stay housed. And I also want to take a second to be very clear and acknowledge there is policy that is in place that is going to sustain all of these conditions that I just talked about. And that's going to exacerbate the homelessness crisis. So, for example, Indiana is just one of a handful of states that does not have rent escrow. What that means is that in other states, if your landlord were to neglect addressing important maintenance or livability work on your unit, you as a tenant could withhold your rent payment until that is seen to. That's not the case in Indiana. Here, if you don't pay, even if your landlord is not doing upkeep on your apartment, you are at risk of eviction. And what we see is that that type of policy is encouraging a lot of businesses outside of Indiana to purchase homes, particularly single-family homes. And so what we're seeing happen are two things. One, the outside businesses are seeing we don't have rent escrow, so in lieu of paying for renovations, they can just evict folks, get the next round of renters in cheap with application fees, or they can see a home that's not been required to have solid upkeep. They can then purchase it cheap, flip it, and then make the rent so high that no one in the neighborhood can afford it. Neither of those are great for housing sustainability. We also know that measures that could work are not always supported. As an example, the Housing Choice Voucher Program can really help improve folks' housing stability, but in Indiana, vouchers are not a protected form of payment. If a landlord sees that someone wants to pay with a housing voucher, that alone is reason that they can refuse to give them a rental unit. And even beyond the housing space, policy isn't always friendly to lower income residents who are probably more at risk of housing instability. At the start of 2024, there was a national study that found Indiana has the 14th most regressive tax system in the nation and the 3rd most regressive tax system in the Midwest. And what that means is that Indiana's tax policies favor those who have higher incomes and are less likely to experience housing instability. So when you take the economic reality that a lot of Hoosiers and a lot of folks in Marion County are struggling, you then couple it with all of these political choices, our city and our state are within an environment that does not naturally support housing stability. And I don't say all this to suggest that it's hopeless. We have decades of evidence on what works. And what works is a housing-first approach that prioritizes getting people who have experienced homelessness into housing that meets their needs, and once they're housed, providing high-quality services that helps keep them housed. And this approach has been shown to improve justice involvement, physical and mental health outcomes, safety, and ultimately housing stability. So what we need are policies that are going to expand and support this approach. So the takeaway for today that I hope that you all leave with is that homelessness is the result of systemic economic and housing issues, which is actually a good thing because that means that policy can address it. We have seen what works in other communities, there's decades of research, and we need our policy to follow suit. That said, we're not all policymakers, and this is where our community comes in. So I also want to make sure that you all leave with some tangible steps that you as community members can do to try to bring about real change, because we need Indy residents who are willing to advocate, support, and engage in this work. So in the space of advocacy, keep in mind your elected officials work for you. If there's an issue that you care about, you can let them know. So the link that you see in orange here, this is actually a link to the Indiana General Assembly website, where you can go and find your state representative and their contact information. You can also use the Indiana Voter Portal to find your current voter registration status, see who's on your ballot for upcoming elections. Then here at the local level, you can also use the link in green to reach out to the City County Council and have your voice be heard here on the local level as well. If you have the means and are so moved, there are also a number of initiatives and programs who are doing the work every day here in Indianapolis. If you take a look at the CHIP and the Continuum of Care website, you will see a ton of organizations and partners who are doing critical work in a number of ways. So if you go on there and you see an organization that really resonates with you, consider volunteering. Spread the word about the work. Support them on the work that they're doing on the ground. We also know that there will be times where folks might meet someone who may be experiencing homelessness and you're not able to give money, but you still want to help. One great way to do that is to use the CHIP Handbooks of Help. The handbooks are essentially resources, are a comprehensive list of resources across the city, including temporary shelter, food assistance, legal help, and youth resources that you can use to help connect folks in need to places throughout the city. In addition to physical copies, we also have electronic versions that you can share if the individual has a phone, and they're available in English, Spanish, and Haitian Creole. I also want to let you all know about these resources. So if you or someone who you know are in an active housing crisis and are seeking help, you can also use the Keys to Housing flyer that's linked here that will help you navigate resources to best meet your specific needs. You can also dial 211 to be connected to a resource navigator online as well. So, with that grounding and understanding of the broad issue of homelessness and ways that you can engage day to day, we're now going to move into the 2025 PIT count portion of the training. So you've just heard a lot of information and a lot of data, so I encourage you, if you need, to pause the video, process as needed, stretch, and then you can move into the next segment. And so this segment will, of course, cover the basics of what you've expressed interest in, and that is, what is the point in time count and what exactly is it that you might be volunteering for? So to start, what is the PIT? So the point in time count, also known as the PIT, is a required federal report. Every year, communities across the country conduct a census on the number of individuals and families who are experiencing homelessness on a single night in January. So again, it is a census of one night who is experiencing homelessness. And for the purpose of the point in time count, when we say experiencing homelessness, we're specifically meaning folks who are in an emergency shelter, so places like Wheeler Mission, Salvation Armies, folks who are in transitional housing, which are temporary shelters that are a little bit more long-term, or folks who are unsheltered. And so those are folks who might be staying in a vehicle, in a tent outside, or an abandoned building. And so ultimately, this will let us know on January 24th in Indianapolis who is meeting the federal definition of homelessness. And the data that we get on the night of the pit is going to tell us a number of things about our neighbors. So first of all, it's going to let us know on that night who is experiencing homelessness and where are they, which lets us know the scope of the issue as well as some of the places that we can connect to folks. It also gives us a chance to get a pulse on the barriers that folks are experiencing. You'll see in the survey that we get data on barriers and events that may have led to folks experiencing homelessness, as well as conditions that make it harder to get housing, such as disabilities, chronic health statuses, things of that nature. The data that you all as volunteers collect on the night of the count is also coupled with data that we get from our shelter systems. And so this lets us not only see the scope of homelessness, but whether people or not are getting into our shelter system. And because it's an annual census, we look at these figures over time to see if any major changes occur. And I also want to be clear that we don't collect the data just to have it. This information is very, very critical and does get used. So at a high level, this data is collected because it means that we qualify for federal funding. The work that you all do as volunteers is absolutely crucial to supporting our neighbors, because if we did not do the pit, we would automatically forfeit our eligibility for about $12 million in federal funding every year. And that's $12 million that we use to get people housed and to keep them housed. That funding last year, in 2023, we were able to keep over 2,000 people who had previously been experiencing homelessness housed in our city. If we did not do the pit, we would absolutely not be able to do that. And the reason that this qualifies us for federal funding is because it actually gets used at the federal level. Our data is sent to Congress to inform federal policy, along with all of the other continuums of care in the nation. On the local level, we also use it in a number of ways. In particular, we use it to address racial disparities in our community. We have seen time after time, year after year, that Black residents are disproportionately experiencing homelessness in our system. That is something that we as a community have committed to addressing and eliminating, and the pit count is one of the metrics that we use to monitor our progress in that goal. It's also, again, an effort for us to expand our outreach efforts and make sure that we know where people are at and how we can reach them. And so keep that in mind if you are going out to do surveys. Whether you survey one individual or 20 individuals, that is equally important, because that helps us coordinate our outreach efforts intentionally and get people connected to care. So here on this slide, there's a lot going on, but I want to take just a second to snapshot some data and show the ways in which we kind of look at the data and how it gets used to inform the local narrative. So over on the left, what you see in this visual, the numbers in black, those are the number of individuals who were counted in total on the night of the pit count for that year. The number that's in the yellow, those are the individuals who are unsheltered, so who are staying outdoors. And the number in blue, those are the individuals who are staying in our shelter system. And so what you see is that following COVID, we saw a huge spike in homelessness in Indianapolis, as did a number of communities across the nation. The number slowly has started going down, but then it is trending back upward again. And I want to reiterate, the increase we saw in 2024, that is not a surprise based on all of the economic data that we shared at the beginning of this training. I also want to point out that if you look at the numbers in yellow, what we're slowly starting to see is more and more people are showing up unsheltered. They're not connecting to our shelter system. And so that's something that we're monitoring as a community as well. The data also helps us to kind of bust some myths and common assumptions about homelessness. So for example, when folks think about homelessness, a lot of times they tend to picture older single adult males. And what we see is that a significant portion of the folks experiencing homelessness in our city are youth and young adults. About 1 in 5 of the folks who we counted in 2024 were age 24 and below, and that includes little ones, minor children. We also saw that about 1 in 4 of the folks experiencing homelessness were experiencing homelessness as a family with a minor child. We also see disparities year after year that we can work together as a community to address. Again, Black individuals and Black families, very disproportionately affected year after year. Among the adult population, veterans disproportionately experience homelessness. And so the pit count and this data that you all collect really helps us see these changes year after year and where progress is being made and where more opportunities for growth are happening. I want to talk very briefly about the 4 different sections of the PIT that we have touched on. So when we get data for the PIT, again, we're getting data for those who are in shelters and those who are unsheltered. So for the sheltered count, that data we get directly from the shelter system. So that data comes directly to us. The folks who are in the shelters do not have to do a survey. We have the data from the shelters, and we will make sure that it's clean, deduplicated, and ready for submission. For folks who are unsheltered, there are 2 ways that we're getting their data. So on the actual night of the point in time count, which again is January 22nd, professional blended street outreach workers who have the relationships and who engage with neighbors day after day, they will be the ones who are going out to different encampments, going out to the abandoned buildings, the vehicles folks stay at. They will be collecting the data on the day of. And again, that's because they have those relationships, they have that trust built, and so they're able to meet folks where they're at. For the other portion of the unsheltered count is where you all as community volunteers come in. So one thing that we know is that folks on the night of the count might not be staying where we expect them to. They might have had to move their tent, they might have moved their vehicle, and so it's possible that we miss folks. And so you all, who will be doing the volunteer portion, are a big piece of making sure they're captured by going and doing service site surveys. So volunteers will be going for the week after the night of the count to places where folks experiencing homelessness can engage in services. So the libraries, food pantries, community centers, and you'll be asking them where did they stay on the night of the PIT. And so again, this is a really good way for us to make sure that we're very comprehensive and make sure that anyone who we missed on the night of the PIT gets captured. I want to reiterate how important this is and how important the work you all as volunteers are with these service-based counts. Doing the counts in January, we don't know what the Indiana weather is going to look like. And so if folks aren't able to be counted that night, you all play a really critical piece in making sure their story is represented in the data that we submit. And then also the 4th pillar, as I mentioned earlier, is the housing inventory count, which is essentially an inventory of how much resources we have to get folks in temporary shelter. Okay, so again, just a very brief timeline, or a very simple timeline of what's happening. Again, January 22nd, that is the night of the count. The week after the night of the count, that is when the site-based surveys happen. And then afterwards, from January to about March, that's where the data cleaning comes in. So the team at CHIP will be taking the shelter data, putting it together with the unsheltered data that you all collect. We'll make sure that no one got counted twice. We'll clean up any data as needed. And then we'll start doing the analysis and crunching the numbers before it actually gets submitted up to HUD and to Congress. I also want to point out quickly, on the national level, PIT data is getting attention, particularly last year and in 2023 as COVID funding was ending. We as a nation are seeing a huge increase in homelessness. It's some of the largest increases we've seen in the history of the point-in-time counts. And so even beyond the data and the utility that we get for our community here, what you're collecting is helping to frame a larger narrative of how serious this crisis is on the national level. And then finally, to wrap up for today, I also want to share kind of our vision for the point-in-time count. As we've been planning for the PIT, we've really tried to be intentional on making sure that we remain people-centered and committed to using this data to get folks connected to care. We want this to be a way of educating people on homelessness and grounding everyone in our city in the fact that every person you meet, every person who is counted, every person reflected in our graphs is a real human with a real experience, and it is our responsibility to improve the system for them. So if you're able to join us in the in-person trainings, that's something that we will really focus in on, is how to conduct these surveys in a way that not only gets us the data, but does it in a way that is respectful and outcomes focused for the individuals who are giving you the gift of their story. With that, I want to thank you again for taking the time to view this introduction to the PIT count and your interest in supporting neighbors. Even if we aren't able to see you at the in-person training, I want to again express my appreciation just for taking the time out, for wanting to learn more. The pit count is a huge effort, and we absolutely would not be able to do it without the support of community members like you. If you have any questions about the point in time count, the training, or any of the information you saw today, please don't hesitate to reach out to any of the CHIP staff listed here so we can connect with you. Again, we appreciate you learning and supporting with us. So go on out, be kind to each other, and thank you again.